evening. It's Thursday, September 17th. Hopes for new coronavirus economic relief legislation reviving after President Trump signals congressional Republicans he favors another boost for the U.S. economy before the election. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says she's ready.
We have a plan. We have had a plan. It's a plan that takes responsibility for testing, tracing, treatment, separation, ventilation, mask wearing, and the rest. We know that will save lives, that will curb the virus, that crush the virus, and again, enable us to open our economy and our schools more safely.
California Governor Gavin Newsom signs 2 bills to increase worker safety during the coronavirus pandemic. He also signs a bill to extend paid family and sick leave to around 6 more million California workers. Help for the financially beleaguered U.S. Postal Service as Democratic Senators Kirsten Gillibrand and Bernie Sanders introduce a Postal Banking Act to authorize the agency to provide banking services. Meanwhile, a federal judge in Washington state blocks changes at the post office that have slowed the delivery of the mail and threatened balloting by mail in the presidential election. A Washington, D.C. National Guard whistleblower says U.S. Defense Department officials sought to acquire a heat ray that could make protesters feel like their skin was on fire to clear them off the Capitol's streets during demonstrations earlier this summer. A new charge of sexual assault leveled against President Trump, and another defector from his administration endorses Joe Biden, saying she heard Trump say that maybe the coronavirus pandemic was a good thing because he wouldn't have to shake hands with disgusting people. From Pacifica Radio, KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, this is the Evening News. I'm Mark Miracle. The World Health Organization's European director is warning countries against reducing the quarantine period for people potentially exposed to the coronavirus, even as he acknowledged that COVID-19 fatigue is setting in and people are increasingly resistant to the strict public health measures needed to control the pandemic. In a press briefing today, Dr. Hans Kluge warned even a slight reduction in the length of the quarantine could have a significant effect on the virus's spread, which he said had grown to alarming rates in Europe. Lucy Huff reports from Brussels.
There has been concern about the recent figures coming out of Europe, with the number of cases now higher than the first peak in March. Back then, there were just in excess of 264,000 cases across Europe. That's now at over 300,000 as we enter flu season. The spike is in part due to increased testing, which means authorities are registering more cases. But the rate of infection is also gaining pace, with more than half of European countries seeing double-digit increases in the last fortnight. The WHO is warning countries not to cut the 14-day quarantine period for anyone exposed to the virus. Lucy Hoff, Brussels.
Britain imposed tougher restrictions today on people and businesses in parts of northeastern England and in Wales as the nation attempts to stem the spread of COVID-19 before the colder winter months. Health Secretary Matt Hancock told the House of Commons that the new measures would include a ban on residents socializing with people outside their own households, ordering leisure and entertainment venues to close from 10 at night until 4 in the morning, and restricting bars and restaurants to table service only. He also promised $3.5 billion to support the National Health Service this winter. Simon Marks has more.
Almost 2 million people in northeast England are facing new restrictions following a rise in COVID-19 cases there, and extra restrictions have gone into force in South Wales. These people in the town of Pontypridd say they are not convinced the localised lockdowns will do the trick.
If you're not having a complete shut-off of services, apart from essential shops, I don't think it's going to do an awful lot of difference in terms of the number of cases.
I think they won't make much difference with it. I think they just all continue doing as they want to do. How are they going to police it?
Simon Marks, Washington.
Over the past 3 days, opposition lawmakers have criticized Prime Minister Boris Johnson's handling of the COVID-19 crisis and said his government lacked a cohesive plan to tackle a second wave of the pandemic. A shortage of testing capacity is a particular concern, with people around the country complaining they were unable to book appointments for tests or directed to testing centers far from their homes. Widespread testing is seen as crucial to controlling the spread of the virus because it allows those who are infected to self-isolate, while helping health officials to identify hot spots and to trace people who were potentially exposed. India reported another record daily increase in coronavirus infections after Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government faced scathing opposition in Parliament over its handling of the pandemic and a contracting economy that has left millions jobless. Confirmed cases totaled nearly 98,000 today, raising India's total past 5.1 million, second in cases only to the United States. The Indian Health Ministry said 1,132 more people had died. Rebecca Bundan reports from Mumbai.
India's coronavirus cases are rising in larger numbers than any other country on a daily basis. The virus has spread from the cities to rural areas where the healthcare infrastructure is weaker. The surging numbers come as the government has continued to allow the economy to open up following a strict nationwide lockdown. And health experts worry that people aren't following precautions, such as wearing masks and practicing social distancing. Doctors say that there are still many infections that are going undetected. Rebecca Bundan, Mumbai.
The total number of people in the United States applying for new unemployment benefits last week totaled 860,000, fewer than the previous week, but still a historically high figure that reflects continuing economic damage from the coronavirus outbreak. Last week, nearly 659,000 people applied for jobless aid under another new program that extends eligibility for the first time to self-employed and gig workers. The Labor Department also said that 12.6 million people are collecting traditional unemployment benefits, compared to 1.7 million a year ago. An extra $600 in weekly unemployment benefits ran out on July 31st, squeezing households that have depended on the increased payments. President Trump issued an executive order on August 8th, providing a scaled-back version of expanded jobless aid. Most states signed up for federal grants that let them increase weekly benefits by $300 or $400, but that program only lasted 3 weeks and is expiring now. In Washington, Democratic lawmakers are largely holding firm behind Democratic proposals for new coronavirus relief legislation. They're holding out for $2.2 trillion package that includes funding for coronavirus testing and for struggling state and local governments. Republicans are proposing a much smaller relief bill. Christopher Martinez reports.
Congress remains at an impasse over action on a new coronavirus relief legislation, but Democrats are holding firm on a more than $2 billion proposal, blasting Republican proposals as too small and ineffective to address the pandemic. Senator Chuck Schumer is a Democrat from New York.
It's September 17th, and President Trump still doesn't have an adequate national testing strategy. So, Democrats in the House, joined by our Senate Democrats, came up with the answer, the $75 billion in testing and tracing funding that's in the HEROES Act. These funds are essential to crush the virus and safely reopen schools and the economy. But our Senate Republicans, led by Keeper of the Graveyard, Leader McConnell, the White House, led by this divisive, nasty, how low can you go president, have refused to do it.
Schumer spoke at House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's news conference on coronavirus testing. The House had passed the $3.4 trillion HEROES Act back in May, but Republican Senate Leader Mitch McConnell has refused to bring it up for a vote. A group of moderate Democratic and Republican lawmakers brought up a much smaller $1.5 trillion proposal earlier this week, but Democrats blocked a vote on that in the Senate, calling that measure emaciated. Now that Trump has suggested he might sign a measure larger than Republicans have proposed, there are some hopes for a compromise. Senator Roy Blunt is a Republican from Missouri.
You know, I think we've always understood we were likely to go up a number. The question is the starting number the $2 trillion in the House package that actually dealt with COVID, or the other trillion that dealt with everything else they could think of? You know, if we're negotiating between $1 trillion and $2 trillion, I think that's a legitimate negotiation. The biggest area of disagreement continues to be whether state and local government should get money we don't have to replace money they don't have. And I think at the end of the day, that's part of getting a deal and will be part of an agreement.
Democratic leaders say they're standing firm behind a $2.2 billion Democratic proposal. That is Pelosi's plan. She compared the Democrats' proposed funding for testing, $75 billion, to smaller Republican proposals.
So when we had $75 billion in the plan that Mr. Pallone put forth and supported by House and Senate Democrats, the Republicans said, we have 15, you have 75, let's compromise. We'll go to 16. Oh, really? Do you not understand the gravity of the situation? Either you do not understand the gravity of the situation or you don't care. But the fact is that 200,000 people in another day or so will have lost their lives to this disregard for science.
Some critics say Democrats are divided over the smaller proposal presented by the so-called problem-solving caucus this week. Pelosi says that's not a problem.
Well, they don't say it to me. What they say is we need to have a solution, and we want the best possible agreement that we can for America's working families. You may have, by anecdotally, someone who may say, I don't care how small it is, I want it just to go. I have not heard that.
Congress has only a few days left in the current fiscal year, but there is still the possibility lawmakers could seize the time to reach a compromise. Pelosi says Democrats will stay till there is an agreement on the next coronavirus relief bill. Reporting for Pacifica Radio News KPFA, I'm Christopher Martinez.
In Sacramento, California lawmakers and farm worker advocates are lobbying Governor Gavin Newsom to sign a first-of-its-kind COVID-19 farm worker relief package. KPFA's Noah Litwer has the story.
Back in March, when worsening coronavirus conditions prompted Governor Gavin Newsom to enact a mandatory stay-at-home order, essential workers were deemed an exception to the rule. 1 in 5 of these essential workers come from the food and agriculture industry, where fewer than 1% of labor is unionized, and worker protections are comparatively weak. On top of lax working conditions, a shortage of seasonal housing forces many farm workers to live in cramped quarters. Farm workers are 3 times more likely to contract the virus than workers in any other industry. Assemblymember Robert Rivas, who heads the Assembly Agriculture Committee, represents the Central Valley farming community and introduced the California COVID-19 Farm Worker Relief Package. He says to protect essential workers providing much of the nation's food supply.
It is my top priority to keep our agriculture industry strong and competitive, and it would be impossible to achieve that without a healthy workforce. Altogether, this legislative package promises needed relief on a variety of fronts for our state's farm and other agricultural workers who, as the data has made very, very clear, are among the most vulnerable for exposure to COVID-19.
Included in the relief package are 2 action requests that the governor's office prioritized farm worker access to protective equipment, PPE, emergency temporary housing, and COVID-19 testing centers, and 3 articles of legislation expanding worker protections and access to telehealth care and judicial services. Irene de Barayqua represents Líderes Campesinas, a network of women and farm worker leaders.
There's still a lot of work that needs to be done with COVID-19 stopping the spread of this virus, securing the ag industry, the food system overall, and the public's health. We have found that what exactly we were trying to prevent has happened. We've seen outbreaks that many of our members, in places that they work, in places that they live, and it's very frustrating. It's frustrating because at times you feel powerless, and many of our members have spoken up, have been testimonies to this. They've lost their jobs for speaking up.
Assembly member Lorena Gonzalez of San Diego is chair of the California Latino Caucus and co-author on the relief package. She believes that now, not only with the pandemic, but also the most devastating fire season in California history, the importance of farm worker health and safety protections are increasingly self-evident.
As chair of the California Latino Caucus, we have been proud to partner and highlight these bills throughout this year. This is a priority. When we started it in April, it was all about COVID. We knew that we needed to take a second look. We didn't know how bad it would get, and it did get bad. It has gotten bad for our agricultural workers, and we know that they're disproportionately affected by the COVID crisis. But now we have on top of that wildfires that are forever, every day, really testing the will of our state to protect agricultural workers.
Despite the coronavirus pandemic and unprecedented fires, farm workers are still laboring in agricultural fields, many in areas with unhealthy air quality. According to a recent UCLA study on public health, since the coronavirus pandemic began, Latinos living in California, who make up 92% of farm workers, have faced a 5-fold increase in deaths. According to the relief package's sponsors, Governor Newsom has made good on the 2 resource requests for PPE, testing, and temporary housing units, but has yet to sign any of the 3 bipartisan bills providing greater worker protection and expanded legal and health services before California's September 30th legislative deadline. This is Noah Litwer reporting from Oakland, California.
You're listening to the Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFC at Fresno, online at kpfa.org. The former director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Tom Frieden, says he's concerned about political pressure on the science of the coronavirus pandemic on the part of the administration. Frieden told CBS this morning that the FDA and the CDC have been unduly influenced by politics when it comes to the emergency drug approvals and when it comes to recommendations. He spoke the day after President Trump publicly contradicted the current CDC head, Dr. Robert Redfield, who told a Senate panel that a widely available coronavirus vaccine is unlikely for about another year. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio delayed again the planned start of in-person learning for most of the more than 1 million students in its public school system, the largest in the country. Bill de Blasio announced that most elementary school students will do remote-only learning until September 29th. Middle and high schools will stay remote through October 1st. The original in-school return date was to be next week. De Blasio said pre-kindergarten students and special education students will resume in-person instruction on Monday as planned, but there's still more work to do to accommodate other students.
Look, we are doing this to make sure that all the standards we've set can be achieved. We've talked about over those last weeks what we gleaned from looking around the entire world, literally, the best practices from around the world. And that meant that we had to have social distancing throughout schools, cleaning constantly, face coverings on students and adults alike, a host of measures that had to be put in place all system-wide. We're continuing to deepen those efforts because we have to meet that gold standard for the good of all in our school community.
De Blasio also said he was hiring 2,000 more educators to deal with what he called the unprecedented challenge of returning children to school during a pandemic. More than 24 major wildfires continue to blaze in California. They've scorched nearly 3.4 million acres so far this year. An update from the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, CAL FIRE.
There are currently over 17,000 firefighters battling wildfires all over the state of California. Those firefighters are currently working on 29 major fires or complexes around the state of California, and there have been more than 29 new initial attack fires within the last 24 hours.
California Governor Gavin Newsom said there's been an average rise in summer temperatures over the past several decades that's had a direct impact on the intensity of the wildfires ravaging the state.
You look over a 40-year period, you're seeing the average temperatures between June and September here in the state of California increase from roughly 71 degrees to about 74 degrees. While that may not seem significant, 3 degrees, it is profoundly impactful. Average temperatures in the state of California during these summer months increasing over the last number of decades is a direct cause and effect to the experience that we're currently having, this climate-induced, human activity-induced, climate-induced wildfire season.
A fire incident report says downed power lines sparked at least 13 fires during a period of high winds last week in Oregon between two Oregon communities. The report doesn't say to what extent those fire starts affected a larger, separate blaze that started on August 16th. President Trump has issued an emergency declaration for Oregon due to the deadly wildfires that have burned across the state. Federal officials have also declared a public health emergency as dangerous smoky conditions continue. Portland's air quality index this morning again showed very unhealthy conditions. Seattle to the north still has unhealthy conditions. The smoke from the dozens of wildfires in California, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho has stretched clear across the country and even pushed into Mexico, Canada, and Europe. Photographs in New York City of an orange sun sinking behind the skyline and glinting through tree leaves flooded social media earlier this week. Yesterday, New Jersey residents described a yellow tinge to the overcast skies there. Satellite images showed that smoke from the wildfires has traveled almost 5,000 miles to Britain and other parts of northern Europe. The Center for Western Priorities conservation group in the Rocky Mountain region said there's no doubt that climate change plays a role in the western fires and that political opposition to dealing with global warming is making things worse. Mike Moen has the story.
The direct impact from these fires is being seen in multiple states, but smoke is also spreading through the air and across the country. Jesse Prentice-Dunn at the Center for Western Priorities fears that without meaningful action, the situation will only get worse.
This year is just a harbinger for what's to come. It's not going to get better unless we take significant efforts to mitigate climate change.
Scientists believe the size of these fires keeps growing because of rising heat and more drought-like patterns consistent with climate change. When he visited the West Coast this week, President Donald Trump downplayed the impact of climate change. And while his opponent, Joe Biden, is actively pushing a proposal to address the issue, some activists worry it doesn't go far enough. Prentice-Dunn says whether it's a new administration taking over or ratcheting up more pressure on policymakers, he says many actions taken by the White House need to be immediately reversed to stop the bleeding.
These wildfires are just being turbocharged by climate change, and the Trump administration is just adding fuel to that fire by rolling back policies aimed at mitigating climate change, expanding drilling and the burning of fossil fuels.
Trump's resistance to acknowledge the issue comes as some Republicans are expressing more of an open mind on climate change, given that younger members of the party are giving it focus. Meanwhile, some on the left wish Biden would be more aggressive on climate change and embrace more elements of a proposed Green New Deal. Mike Moen, Public News Service.
Rescuers on the Gulf Coast used high-water vehicles today to reach people cut off by floodwaters in the aftermath of Hurricane Sally, even as a second round of flooding took shape along rivers and creeks swollen by the storm's heavy rains. Across southern Alabama and the Florida Panhandle, homeowners and businesses began cleaning up, and officials inspected bridges and highways for safety. A day after Sally rolled through with 105-mile-an-hour winds, a surge of seawater, and up to 1 to 2.5 feet of rain in many places, before the storm began to break up. Sally's remnants were over South Carolina this afternoon and were expected to move into the Atlantic within 24 hours. A rainmaker to the end, what was left of the storm was forecast to dump as much as 8 inches in isolated areas in the Carolinas and southern Virginia, prompting warnings of widespread flash flooding and moderate river flooding. As much as 8 inches of rain had fallen in central Georgia by midday. In hard-hit Pensacola and surrounding environs where Sally's floodwaters had coursed through downtown streets and lapped at car door handles before receding yesterday, authorities went door to door to check on residents and warn them they were not out of danger. Like the wildfires raging on the West Coast, the onslaught of hurricanes has focused attention on climate change, which scientists say is causing slower, rainier, more powerful, and more destructive storms. Attorney General Bill Barr has likened coronavirus restrictions to slavery.
Putting a national lockdown, stay-at-home orders is like house arrest. It's other than slavery, which was a different kind of restraint, this is the greatest intrusion on civil liberties in American history.
Barr spoke to a Constitution Day celebration at the private conservative Hillsdale College in Michigan. In his speech, Barr also took aim at his own Justice Department, criticizing prosecutors for behaving as headhunters in their pursuit of prominent targets and for using the weight of the criminal justice system to launch what he said were ill-conceived political probes. His remarks amounted to a striking and unusual rebuke of the thousands of prosecutors who do the daily work of assembling criminal cases across the country. Barr has faced scrutiny for overruling the decisions of Justice Department prosecutors who work for him, including in criminal cases involving associates of President Trump. Rejecting the notion that prosecutors should have final say in cases that they bring, Barr described them instead as part of the permanent bureaucracy and suggested they need to be supervised and even reined in by politically appointed leaders like himself, accountable to the president and the Congress. Barr said, name one successful organization where the lowest level employees' decisions are deemed sacrosanct. There aren't any. He added, letting the most junior members set the agenda might be a good philosophy for a Montessori preschool, but it's no way to run a federal agency. Good leaders at the Justice Department and at any organization need to trust and support their subordinates, but that does not mean blindly deferring to whatever those subordinates want to do. Barr's speech came as published reports said that Barr told federal prosecutors he wants them to be aggressive in charging those at protests against police violence. He said some protesters should be charged with sedition if they had committed violence. He also asked federal prosecutors to see if they could bring criminal charges against the mayor of Seattle, Jenny Durkin, for allowing some protesters to establish a so-called autonomous zone this summer. Barr held a conference call this week with U.S. attorneys nationwide. So far, more than 300 people have been charged with federal crimes in the protests that erupted following the Minneapolis police killing of George Floyd. Barr pushed U.S. attorneys to bring federal charges whenever they could and to keep a grip on the cases, even if a defendant could be tried instead in state court. Lawmakers, some of those cases should not be in federal court at all, including a teenager accused of civil disorder for saying online, "We are not each other's enemy, only enemy is 12, a reference to law enforcement. Meanwhile, a Washington, D.C. National Guard whistleblower said that hours before law enforcement agents used force to clear protesters from Lafayette Square in early June so President Trump could hold a photo op with a Bible, U.S. Defense Department officials sought to acquire a heat ray that could make protesters feel like their skin was on fire. The Washington Post obtained sworn congressional testimony by D.C. National Guard Major Adam D. DeMarco. According to the Post, he told lawmakers that defense officials were searching for crowd control technology deemed too unpredictable to use in war zones. He said that federal officials began to stockpile ammunition and to seek the heat rays and other devices that could emit deafening sound. That's according to the Post. The Washington Post and the Defense Department, U.S. Army, and D.C. National Guard not responding to specific questions about munitions and the intended use of the devices. The ACLU is again demanding an independent investigation into the use of force against protesters. 6 months after Louisville police officers shot and killed 26-year-old Breonna Taylor in her home, city officials announced this week they will pay her family $12 million, one of the highest settlement amounts ever paid for the wrongful death of a black woman. Nadia Ramlagan reports.
The 3 police officers involved in the shooting have not been criminally charged, and Louisville resident Tara Blakely, who has been attending the ongoing protests, says that's a problem.
If we stand for nothing, then we'll fall for anything, and they have to be held accountable for their actions.
Mayor Greg Fisher also announced the city will begin implementing reforms related to search warrants, community policing, and police accountability. Earlier this summer, Louisville's city council voted unanimously to ban no-knock search warrants. Known as Breonna's Law, the order requires all officers who serve warrants to wear body cameras and have them turned on before and after the warrant is served. The demand of protesters to arrest and charge the police officers involved in the shooting have only grown louder. Blakely says the injustice in the case has drawn hundreds of residents out into the streets this summer, many of whom have never protested before.
This is actually the first time I've been to a protest, but I do fully support this because, like I said, it has to be corrected.
Attorney Benjamin Crump, who is representing Breonna Taylor's family, has pressed Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron to bring second-degree manslaughter charges against the police officers. However, experts say Kentucky statutes allow the police to use their weapons in self-defense and may provide legal protection for the officers' actions. Cameron says the investigation remains ongoing. For Public News Service, I'm Nadia Ramlagan.
One of the 2 Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies shot in an ambush attack last weekend has been released from the hospital. The 31-year-old female deputy and 24-year-old male deputy underwent surgery after the shooting Saturday evening in Compton. The female deputy remains hospitalized. Sheriff Alex Villanueva tweeted that investigators are pursuing promising leads in the search for the gunman, who was recorded on surveillance video. A reward for information leading to an arrest has grown to $300,000. You're listening to the evening news on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org. It's an hour-long newscast with a half-hour edition on the weekends. They all air at 6 o'clock. Or when you like to air them, because they're archived online, or you can listen to them at your leisure at kpfa.org. I'm Mark Miracle. Yet another woman has come forward to say Donald Trump sexually assaulted her. Former model Amy Doris told the Guardian newspaper she was 24 years old in 1997 when Trump assaulted her outside the bathroom in his VIP box at the U.S. Open tennis tournament.
He just grabbed me and he just shoved his tongue down my throat and I was pushing him off, and then that's when his grip became tighter and his hands were kind of like very gropey and all over my butt, my breast, my back, like everything. But he was just like, his grip was hard. You couldn't pull away. I was pushing his tongue out of my mouth with my teeth. It was pretty traumatic and jarring and shocking.
She said the alleged incident left her feeling sick and violated. Via his lawyers, Trump denied ever having harassed, abused, or behaved improperly toward Doris. The Guardian says Doris provided evidence to support her account, including her ticket to the U.S. Open and 6 photographs showing her with Trump over several days in New York. Trump was 51 at the time and married to his second wife, Marla Maples. The Guardian says the account was corroborated by several people that Doris told at the time about the incident. The Guardian says Doris, who's now 48 and a mother to twin daughters, said she had considered speaking out publicly after the incident in the year 2016, the election year for President Trump, when several women made public similar accusations against the then Republican candidate for president. But she decided against coming forward in part because she thought that doing so might harm her family. She said now that her daughters are 13, she wants to be a role model and show them that she stood up to somebody who did something that was unacceptable. President Donald Trump today announced the formation of a commission on patriotic education and derided anti-racism training as divisive during a speech commemorating the signing of the U.S. Constitution. Trump's speech also downplayed slavery in an appeal to his white conservative base. KPFA's Christina Onnested reports.
President Donald Trump is intensifying his efforts to appeal to his core base of white voters by downplaying the historical legacy of slavery in the U.S. and blasting efforts to address systemic racism as divisive. He lamented anti-racism trainings as a form of anti-American indoctrination that shames whiteness. He made those polarizing statements during a speech commemorating the 233rd anniversary of the signing of the Constitution.
Students in our universities are inundated with critical race theory. This is a Marxist doctrine, holding that America is a wicked and racist nation, that even young children are complicit in oppression, and that our entire society must be radically transformed. A perfect example of critical race theory was recently published by the Smithsonian Institution. This document alleged that concepts such as hard work, rational thinking, and the nuclear family and belief in God were not values that unite all Americans, but were instead aspects of whiteness. This is offensive and outrageous to Americans of every ethnicity, and it is especially harmful to children of minority backgrounds who should be uplifted, not disparaged. Teaching this horrible doctrine to our children is a form of child abuse.
Ignoring the harms caused by slavery, Trump argued America's founding set in motion an unstoppable chain of events that abolished slavery, secured civil rights, defeated communism and fascism, and built the most fair, equal, and prosperous nation in history. But he failed to mention 246 years of slavery in the U.S., including an additional 89 years slavery was allowed to continue after colonies declared independence from England. Nor did the president acknowledge the ongoing fight against racial injustice and police brutality, which has prompted months of protests this year alone. Instead, he launched a defense of white culture and a denunciation of Democrats, the media, and the left wing, who he described as un-American.
Left-wing mobs have torn down statues of our founders, desecrated our memorials, and carried out a campaign of violence and anarchy. Far-left demonstrators have chanted the words, "America was never great." Whether it is the mob on the street or the cancel culture in the boardroom, the goal is the same: to silence dissent, to scare you out of speaking the truth, and to bully Americans into abandoning their values, their heritage, and their very way of life.
Trump decried historians like Howard Zinn and the New York Times 1619 Project, which highlights the long-term consequences of slavery in the U.S. and highlights the contributions of Black Americans. It's named after the first documented arrival of slaves to the U.S. in 1619, and it came about after an article on the issue in the New York Times won a Pulitzer Prize. Trump has already banned anti-racism training sessions in federal agencies. He said next he'll sign an order establishing a commission to promote patriotic education, dubbed the 1776 Commission. The panel, he says, will be tasked with encouraging educators to teach students what he calls the miracle of American history.
We must clear away the twisted web of lies in our schools and classrooms and teach our children the magnificent truth about our country. We want our sons and daughters to know that they are the citizens of the most exceptional nation in the history of the world.
Trump has long fanned the flames of the nation's culture wars, including defending the display of the Confederate battle flag and monuments of Civil War rebels from protesters seeking their removal. His speech suggests his rhetoric could become even more polarized in the final weeks before the election, given his path to a second term relies largely on energizing culturally conservative white voters. I'm Christina Onnested reporting for KPFA.
A former advisor to Vice President Mike Pence has joined the chorus of former Trump administration officials, urging voters to deny him a second term. Olivia Troy was Pence's former Homeland Security advisor and served as a member of the White House's coronavirus task force. She says in a new video released today by the group Republican Voters Against Trump that Trump was more concerned about his re-election chances than the virus. She says if the president had taken the virus seriously, he would have saved lives. She also claims Trump once suggested the coronavirus might be a good thing because it would stop him from having to shake hands with disgusting people.
I'm Olivia Troy. I was Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor to Vice President Pence and served as Vice President Pence's lead staff member on the COVID-19 response. I'd been on the COVID task force from day one. The virus was very unpredictable at the beginning. There were a lot of unknowns, but towards the middle of February, we knew it wasn't a matter of if COVID would become a big pandemic here in the United States. It was a matter of when. But the president didn't want to hear that because his biggest concern was that we were in an election year. And how is this going to affect what he considered to be his record of success? It was shocking to see the president saying that the virus was a hoax, saying that everything's okay when we know that it's not. The truth is, he doesn't actually care about anyone else but himself.
Olivia Troy says she is a lifelong Republican who plans to vote for Democrat Joe Biden for president. The White House adamantly denies Troy's allegations. Vice President Pence said her remarks read, quote, to me like one more disgruntled employee that has decided to play politics during election year. You're listening to the Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online, kpfa.org.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Edwards-Teekert.
And I'm Kat Brooks.
Weekday mornings we host Upfront.
2 hours of conversation about what's in the news and what should be.
Politics, technology.
Prisons, police.
What's happening in City Hall and at the State House.
In Washington and in the streets.
That's starting at 7 a.m. right after Democracy Now!
On Upfront.
A U.S. judge today blocked controversial Postal Service changes that have slowed mail nationwide, calling them a politically motivated attack on the efficiency of the Postal Service before the November election. Federal Judge Stanley Bastian in Yakima, Washington, said he was issuing a nationwide preliminary injunction sought by 14 states that sued the Trump administration and the U.S. Postal Service. The states challenged the Postal Service's so-called leave behind policy, where trucks have been leaving postal facilities on time, regardless of whether there is more mail to unload. They also sought to enforce the Postal Service to treat election mail as first-class mail. The judge noted after a hearing that Trump had repeatedly attacked voting by mail by making unfounded claims that it's rife with fraud. Many more voters are expected to vote by mail this November because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the states have expressed concern that delays might result in voters not receiving ballots or registration forms in time. Judge Bastian said that the states have demonstrated the defendants are involved in a politically motivated attack on the efficiency of the Postal Service. He also said the changes created a substantial possibility many voters will be disenfranchised. Bastian, appointee of former President Barack Obama, said he planned to issue a written order later today, but that it would be substantially the same as that sought by the states. Following a national uproar, Postmaster General Louis DeJoy, a major donor to President Trump and the Republican Party, announced he was suspending some changes, including the removal of iconic blue mailboxes in many cities and the decommissioning of mail processing machines. But other changes remained in place. And the states, including the battlegrounds of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Nevada, asked the court to block them. The states sought to have the leave behind policy revoked, election mail treated as first-class mail rather than as slower-moving categories, the reinstallation of any mail processing machines needed to ensure the prompt handling of election mail, and that the court hold Postmaster DeJoy to his promise to suspend other changes. Led by Washington Attorney Bob Ferguson, the state said the Postal Service made the changes without first bringing them to the Postal Regulatory Commission for public comment and an advisory opinion, as required by federal law. They also said the changes interfered with their constitutional authority to administer their elections. Meanwhile, two lawmakers introduced the Postal Banking Act today, which would allow post offices around the country to provide basic banking services. Senators Democrat Kirsten Gillibrand of New York and Independent Bernie Sanders of Vermont introduced the bill to help build back reserves for the U.S. Postal Service. The senators say postal banking is an old idea and a good idea to help low-income and rural communities with limited banking access, and it helps the Postal Service avert financial disaster. KPFA's Chris Lee reports.
The Postal Banking Act would allow tens of thousands of post offices across the country to provide basic banking services like checking and savings accounts up to $20,000. That's not a new concept. Postal banking was offered in the United States for more than 50 years between 1911 and 1966. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, Democrat from New York, is co-sponsor of the act. She calls postal banking America's most successful experiment in financial inclusion.
And the best thing about postal banking is that we know it already works. Today, the U.S. Postal Service does over $20 billion a year in money orders. And from 1911 to 1966, it offered many of the products that we are proposing, helping millions of low-income families through the Great Depression and 2 world wars. At this moment, when families are facing growing economic uncertainty and a widening wealth gap, it could not be more needed.
Supporters of the Postal Banking Act say it would be a safer alternative to predatory lenders on Wall Street and profit-driven banks. The Postal Banking Act would also allow the USPS, U.S. Postal Service, to offer accessible small dollar loans under $500 at an interest rate not to exceed roughly 2%. That's exceedingly low compared to other retail options for small personal loans. It's also the rate that the federal government lends its money to corporate banks. Gillibrand says a postal banking system would contribute positively to closing the wealth gap by making predatory lending schemes like payday loans obsolete. Independent Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont says cost-cutting measures implemented by the Trump administration's Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, have slowed mail delivery in rural communities. Sanders, a co-sponsor of the legislation, says if this bill passes, it could be a real boon for rural Americans, like those in his district who often have limited banking access.
What this does is allow people in the smallest communities all over America where there is a postal service to be able to take advantage of affordable banking. And it also reverses the trend where the Postal Service has wanted to shut down rural postal services in America. And this would help us maintain the post offices in those communities where they are really so important.
The Postal Banking Act would bring an estimated $9 billion in yearly revenue to the Postal Service. Well before the coronavirus pandemic struck, the Postal Service had been operating at a loss since 2017, the year after Congress passed a law requiring the agency to pre-fund 75 years' worth of pension benefits. A bill to repeal that law and relieve the USPS of this responsibility, H.R. 2382, passed the House with bipartisan support earlier this year, but it has languished in the Republican-controlled Senate. According to the American Postal Workers Union, approximately 60% of the country's 30,000 post offices are located in zip codes with one bank or no bank, which indicates that the USPS is well positioned to reach people in places with little to no access to banking services. I'm Chris Lee, reporting for KPFA.
California Governor Gavin Newsom signed 2 bills today to increase worker safety during the coronavirus pandemic. While applauded by some labor groups like the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, advocates say more needs to be done. They're demanding that Cal OSHA pass emergency worker safety legislation to protect workers not covered by current rules. Newsom also signed a bill which will extend paid family and sick leave to around 6 million more California workers. KPFA's Kate Eder reports.
California companies now have to warn their workers if they might have been exposed to the coronavirus, and they'll have to pay employees workers' compensation benefits if they get sick due to 2 new laws that Governor Gavin Newsom signed. San Bernardino Democrat Eloise Gomez-Reyes introduced Assembly Bill 685, which requires that companies notify both employees and local public health officials when someone in the workplace tests positive for COVID-19.
AB 685 will change the level of protection for our workers. It will ensure that workers are informed when there has been a workplace exposure to COVID-19, as well as provide the state of California with the tools necessary to protect workers and get accurate data about outbreaks. The population of essential workers that are most at risk for exposure to COVID-19 are those that can least afford to get sick. With the signing of this bill, Governor, California leads the way in establishing common sense worker protections.
Newsom also signed Senate Bill 1159, which makes employees who contract the coronavirus at work eligible for workers' compensation benefits. The law takes effect immediately, and it applies to all workers, but it treats first responders and healthcare workers differently. State agencies are also taking action to provide workers with greater protections during the pandemic, but it took mass mobilizing for that. A group of more than 35 labor unions, workers' centers, and others successfully demanded California's Division of Occupational Safety and Health, or Cal OSHA, pass a temporary emergency standard with tougher regulations on employers to protect their workers from coronavirus risk. Workers from multiple industries, including delivery drivers, farm workers, nurses, food service workers, janitors, educators, car wash workers, airport employees, and retail workers, attended Cal OSHA's board meeting in support of the petition. Mireya Denise Zaragoza is with the Warehouse Worker Resource Center.
We continuously hear reports of employers who are not complying or enforcing preventative measures in the workplace to protect workers against COVID-19 transmissions. Existing Cal OSHA standards that protect and prevent injury and illnesses in the workplace do not address specific preventative measures nor employer guidelines against COVID-19.
The petition urged workplace protections for employees that are not currently protected by Cal-OSHA standards. It states that the emergency protections should apply to everyone working during the pandemic, not just essential workers. The petition for new regulations go beyond the worker protections Newsom signed into law. They would require employers to provide their workers with free personal protective equipment that meets public health standards, and if employees are interacting with customers closer than 6 feet, it would require that they be given N95 masks and face shields. It would also require employees to send at-risk workers home if there is a positive coronavirus case in the workplace, along with other measures. But some employers and business groups oppose the petition, saying that current Cal-OSHA protections are enough to protect workers. Steve McCarthy is with the California Retailers Association.
This is one more set of rules on top of existing local ordinances, state and local health orders, and state guidances, as well as companies' own policies that will make compliance more challenging and potentially confusing. This seems to us like a one-size-fits-all approach when different industries have not all had the same issues with COVID transmission in the workplace.
But the Cal-OSHA board unanimously approved the petition for a temporary emergency standard to protect California workers from COVID-19 risks. Board member Laura Stock says it's a necessary move.
It's really impossible for anyone to claim that this is not an emergency and not a significant problem that we need to address. It's impossible to claim that most employers are complying and that there's no need for action. Having a particular COVID-19 regulation will actually address the confusion that many people have testified to of the existence of many different guidelines from health departments, including the voluntary guidelines that Cal-OSHA has issued.
The board plans to release the temporary emergency worker protection standard by a deadline in November. Reporting for KPFA Pacifica Radio, I'm Kate Ida.
San Jose is receiving $4.5 million in state funding to purchase a 76-unit property for permanent housing for homeless people. The city's one of the first to benefit from the $600 million Project Home Key. Contra Costa County will receive $21 million for a 176-room Motel 6 in Pittsburgh as permanent housing. It's currently being used as a pandemic shelter. Altogether, Governor Gavin Newsom announced the award of more than $76 million from the Project Home Key Fund, including for smaller and rural communities.
A number of them, like Mendocino County, you see on this list. This is the first ever project of its type within that county. Project areas like Tahoe and Lake Elsinore. We also have projects in El Centro focusing on foster youth in particular, homeless youth, many that have been emancipated or dropped through the cracks in our foster system. Pittsburgh, California, we recently were at a Motel 6 site that's being used currently to provide access and opportunity.
The East Bay Times reports that the state received 138 applications requesting more than $1 billion, nearly twice as much money as is available. Trump family lawyers said in a court filing today that President Donald Trump's son, Eric, is willing to comply with a subpoena to testify in a New York investigation into the family's business practices, but only after the November 3rd election. The lawyers argued Eric Trump's extreme travel schedule related to his father's re-election campaign prevented him from testifying any sooner in State Attorney General Letitia James' civil probe. James, a Democrat, slammed the younger Trump's purported scheduling conflicts, responding, "We won't allow any entity or individual to dictate how our investigation will proceed or allow anyone to evade a lawful subpoena. No one's above the law, period." Mostly cloudy tomorrow morning in the San Francisco Bay Area. Sunshine by the afternoon with highs near 70 degrees. Further inland, partly cloudy with highs near 80 degrees. In Los Angeles, partly cloudy, highs in the low 90s.
This is a community announcement for September 2020. The Sonoma County Bicycle Coalition calls for a Bike to Wherever Day on Thursday, September 24th. When you register, you can get a Love to Ride app, participate virtually in special events, and enter a drawing for prizes. To register, go to bikesonoma.org. That's bikesonoma.org. This community announcement is produced by the First Voice Apprenticeship Program. Please send your listing for consideration to KPFA at 1929 Martin Luther King Jr. Way, Berkeley 94704, or email calendar@kpfa.org. To hear this calendar again, call 510-848-6767 extension 621, or view it online at kpfa.org.
Apex Express